One possibility comes from neurochemistry. When the brain believes that death is imminent, it goes into a kind of shutdown mode, and during this process, it can release massive amounts of endorphins, dopamine, even possibly DMT, which is a naturally occurring, psychedelic effect. These chemicals are known to produce intense euphoria, feelings of unity, a blurring of the boundary between self and universe. In other words, your brain might be trying to comfort you as you die. Instead of letting you panic, it gives you kind of a neurochemical morphine drip, flooding you with peace and awe as your systems are painfully being shut down.
True. Although veridical perception exists. Again, this is where it always comes back to, we can have all of these explanations for the subjective things. We can always speculate. But when it comes to the veridical perception, these don't work because they shouldn't happen.
Some researchers even speculate that this might be evolution's way of making death less terrifying, the same way that our subconscious, we know from terror management studies, is doing so much to compartmentalize death so that it's in the background. Maybe as we're dying, this is evolution's way of making death less painful and less terrifying. Another explanation is the default mode network deactivation. We talk a lot on this channel and other places in spirituality about the default mode network, which is the part of the brain that gives you a sense of self. It's your inner narrator, your ego.
Which that's the part of the brain that I mentioned either earlier or in the previous video, or maybe a couple of videos ago, I don't know. I'm recording it all as one long thing. The default mode network, the activity in that area decreases during psychedelic experiences, at least in that area. But again, it's contested as to whether the entire brain is kind of hyper-connected at that point, or whether there's just a decrease in the activity. I don't think we know yet. I'm not sure. But that's that part of the brain that she's talking about.
The part of you that feels like I'm a me and I'm separate from everything else. So when people take psychedelics like psilocybin or undergo extreme stress, this network will go offline. And what that does is that people will report.
I don't know if it goes offline or whether it's just limited. Its functionality is limited, or its activity is limited. I'm not sure. I don't think it goes fully offline.
A loss of ego and this sense of being like one with the universe, because you no longer have that like inner narrator.
But another very important aspect of this, again, comes down to the old classic correlation causation question. We know certainly that consciousness experience is tied very closely to brain activity. Can we say it's a causational link? No. We can easily say it is, reasonably, very reasonably so. But we can just as reasonably say this is what happens during these experiences, but doesn't necessarily mean that these brain regions are producing this activity. Something could be happening and that appears as the default mode network lighting up or shutting down. It's similar to Bernardo Kastrup's analytical idealism. The brain is what experience looks like. And the example that I've used is on my digital piano. If I press the C key, then a little LED flashes up saying C on it. And of course the note plays. And that's like saying, well, this C light, every time I see that C light, I hear the noise. So that LED that's showing the C is producing the sound. It's not. But it happens every time. So that's a correlatory thing. The LED light is what happens when an external force is acted upon the piano. Equally, the brain responses could be the reaction of something to the brain, I suppose, or the act of the brain interpreting or filtering or whatever other philosophies of consciousness there are, as opposed to generating.
And again, you can do this with drugs or meditation. We can watch your brain while you feel this. Some people will say, I felt pure love, or I felt like one with everything. And that may be exactly what it feels like when that part of your brain that creates an identity goes quiet because you're dying.
Or is associated with the sense of an identity.
Now let's talk about the life review, because this one's interesting. This one shows up so often in near-death experiences that it almost becomes expected. We just have...
It's actually quite rare. It's actually quite rare in NDEs, as far as I'm aware. Interestingly, I assumed it was kind of with everyone, but as well as the tunnel, which is quite interesting. The kind of the most associated thing with near-death experiences is going down the tunnel. That's not common in near-death experiences, and I don't think the life review is either.
This normal phrase in society that my entire life flashed before my eyes. But it's not like watching a movie. They describe like reliving key moments, but from the perspective of others. They feel what their mom felt when they slammed the door as a teenager. They feel the hurt of the stranger they snapped at in traffic. Some say,
and also the effects that stranger who's now in a bad mood had on other people as an indirect effect of the person's actions. Interesting.
they re-experience small forgettable moments but with huge emotional weight, like sharing a toy on the playground.
Things that you think are inconsequential that actually maybe weren't so inconsequential.
Or comforting someone who is sad. And it's often described as this like panoramic, hyper emotional, non-judgmental but immersive experience of one's life. And
which again is in opposition to what Brittany described accurately earlier, that many people experience what they expect to. So as such, in Christianity, with Judgment Day, one would expect a God to be sat on a throne or something. That's how I imagine it. And judging, pointing his finger at you, saying there, hell, heaven, hell. But that never happens. At least, well, I can't say it never happens. I don't know everybody's NDE, but certainly I've heard very few reports of, if any, reports of an external judge, certainly vastly outnumbered by more of a self-judgment thing with these life reviews, which is against what one would expect if it was purely a fabrication of the mind through expectation.
Many people say, as they're coming out of it, that they want to live differently, more kindly, more intentionally, because they're aware of how their actions ripple out into the universe. So the question is, like, why would a brain do this? If you're dying, why not just fade to black? Why the sudden, like, emotional highlight reel? And there's a few possibilities. I don't know. I'm just talking possibilities. First, we know that memory gets weird under extreme circumstances. People who have been in car accidents or combat sometimes say that their whole life flashed before their eyes. It's not just a metaphor. There's research that
time also slows down, which is quite interesting. At least one's experience of time slows down. Many have reported that, say, during, as you said, during a car accident, that they suddenly start driving very slow, as if time's being, is dilated the right word? I don't know, but as if time is being just on slow motion. Very interesting. It's the same with when people are falling off cliffs, which I don't know why it happens a lot, but it seems to.
Adrenaline spikes or trauma, your brain can retrieve and compress an enormous amount of memory content in a very short amount of time. This is sometimes called time dilation, where seconds can feel like minutes or hours. When someone is near death, their brain may be doing one last full system scan, accessing deep emotional memory to make sense of what's happening. The brain may be trying to contextualize what's about to occur by looking back over everything that led to this moment. Some researchers call this final integration a kind of psychological reckoning or narrative closure, where the brain is just trying to sort through things in order to make sense, but it's also running out of oxygen to be able to do that. And so it just kind of shows up at these random memories. There's also the theory that the brain is trying to resolve unfinished business by tying up narrative ends, because of course our brains are storytellers. It's making peace. It's revisiting what mattered, because what we know about the brain is that it is deeply narrative. It wants coherence. It wants resolution. And in the face of death, the brain might be trying its best to provide that, a final act of meaning making, even if it's happening in a few seconds of neural fireworks. So does that mean that it's all imaginary? Like, no, it just means that the brain is doing what the brain does, creating order out of chaos, pulling a...
Yeah, understandable, perfectly reasonable, but we'd need evidence to show that that is what's happening. I don't know if there is or not. I haven't really looked at these, which, to be honest, is the first time I've heard them, but the problem is again, all the other evidence that suggests that maybe consciousness is not within the brain, and if so, then these kind of experiences are reasonably explainable, I suppose. Well, not quite reasonably, because we don't know the mechanisms, but it can be reasonably said that maybe these experiences are not purely brain fabrications or brain activity, at least from a causational perspective. Because again, it's not just near-death experiences from a subjective point of view. It's veridical perception, it's evidential mediumship, it's terminal lucidity, it's remote viewing, it's psi phenomena, it's the fact that we haven't got a clue how the brain produces consciousness. It's that we don't know how the brain, how non-conscious matter can give rise to conscious matter, if it's all just matter, which is effectively non-conscious. And I'm sure, a lot of people, when I mention the list, especially of the supernatural quote unquote phenomena, will probably roll in their eyes, but read the research. It's interesting. Something's going on. And I don't mean the opinion pieces on the internet. I mean, read the papers, read the journals, talk to the people. I've talked to a lot of researchers who have been doing this for decades exclusively. They know what they're doing, they know what they're talking about, and a lot of them are perfectly happy to talk to anybody who's interested on the subject. So reach out, learn about the actual science going on here, because there is a lot more evidence than most people would know, and reasonably so, because it's not really the interest of many people, because it's already deemed to be impossible or woo-woo or whatever. But there is some really interesting data out there, properly researched data as well.
Emotion and memory and identity together in one attempt to understand what's happening to it. And it's also maybe looking for information that may be helpful for what's happening right now by sorting through things. The fact that you can experience that life flash before my eyes many other ways than just near-death experiences tells me that this is something that brains can do, either to look for information or create meaning out of a situation, or both, or to tie up loose ends. So I think you get my drift so far, but
again, you're assuming here that the brain is the base of things, and that this is all kind of brain tricks, which it could be, certainly, but it could also not be. And so there's that possibility as well.
Let's talk about a few of the popular NDE stories that people always come back as proof that all of my skepticism is bullshit, essentially.
Eben Alexander's got to be in here, surely. Pam Reynolds, maybe. That's a well-known one. Let's see. And no, your skepticism isn't bullshit. Your skepticism is perfectly reasonable. Everything you've said is perfectly reasonable. And these are the sort of ways people should be thinking about this. Again, look for natural explanations first. It's just from what I've seen and what I've spoken to people who've researched this stuff, and I've been doing this since 2014. I started the channel in 2018, but I've been doing it long before that. And at least from my perspective, there's more than enough evidence to put me more on the side of there's something that we haven't understood yet about the nature of consciousness that suggests that it doesn't annihilate at death, and that it might not have a causal relationship from the brain, and instead be some kind of more of a fundamental nature in the universe. Like, is gravity a good example? Like gravity, like quantum mechanics. A fundamental aspect of the universe that is expressed through physical matter. How? I don't know. Idealism is a good one. I think that makes a lot of sense. I haven't looked much at panpsychism. I don't know about dualism, but there seems to be something going on, and the evidence is there strongly, I think, to show it. You just need to really know the literature and talk to the people that have done this exclusively, and and really want to find it, and not rely on opinion pieces on the internet, because it just becomes an echo chamber after a while. But you also have to be open to being correct and wrong, because science is 250 years old, something like that. Modern science, we don't know jack. I mean, we know a lot about how the universe works. At least the parts we know about. We know how it works, how it functions, how to use it. We don't have a clue what consciousness is. We don't know why it's there. We don't know where it comes from. We don't know things about the universe that we haven't even begun to conceptualize of yet. Just because it's so complex and so unknown, that it seems reasonable to me that consciousness is one of those many, many unknowns. And as I say, the phenomenon and the research done on the phenomena, seem to suggest that that's a reasonable take, at least to me.
So These stories are very powerful. They're emotional. That's why they feel so convincing. But when we take a closer look, we often find that what makes the story convincing isn't the evidence, it's the storytelling. It's the
Yes,
emotion, it's the hindsight bias, it's the details we fill in after the fact. So
absolutely.
here are some of the most famous ones. The first one is Ibn
Yeah,
Alexander. I actually don't know how to say some of these names because I've
Eben.
only
I
read
think
these
it's
names.
Eben.
It's one of those instances where like I don't actually listen to a lot of NDE YouTubes, but I will read about it. So I'm going to go with Eben for Eben, Alexander, Proof of Heaven. This is probably the most famous modern NDE story because he's a doctor and he's a neurosurgeon who had a severe brain infection and spent a week in a coma. And during that
Gram-negative bacterial meningitis. Scary.
time, he said he went to a place of clouds and light, met a divine being, and learned that consciousness exists beyond the body. He says he couldn't have been hallucinating because his cortex was completely shut down. And this book sold millions of copies. It was a bestseller, and people clung to it as confirmation because he's a man of science. That's what made it so juicy. But here's the issue. When real neuroscientists reviewed his case, they found that his cortex was not fully shut down. He was in a coma, but he was not brain dead. He was still taking in information. And there's no reason to think that the experience couldn't have happened while he was coming out of the coma or even as he was going under while the brain was still more active. And in fact, some doctors involved in his treatment have publicly said, that the science in his book is not accurate. The doctors that were involved in his treatment.
I don't know. I spoke with Eben for the channel a while ago. He would obviously contest that. I haven't seen that. That his doctors have come out and said about the science. I mean, it was a long time ago, but I think I brought up some of the things about, how do we know that this experience didn't take place when your brain was, in a more active state while it was coming online or shutting down. I can't remember. It's useless, isn't it? I can't remember. It was such a long time ago, but I can't remember what his rebuttals were to that. We spoke a lot about his experience and a lot about the Dittrich article and that kind of thing. But I'll have to look. I'll have to look a bit more maybe into that. In terms of his doctors coming forward and information coming out about the state of his brain being not as he described, I don't know. I've never seen that. I'll have to have a look maybe and see, but I haven't seen that before. It's been a while though since Eben came on to my channel, so maybe I could reach out again and ask him some of this, see what his thoughts are on it himself. But yeah, I mean, if that's true and his brain wasn't necessarily in such a compromised state, then that certainly kind of would bring up questions for me.
So while the experience was profound for him, the claim doesn't hold up anything about afterlife or a sense of self that continues on after death. It just doesn't hold up under scrutiny because of the neuroscientists who reviewed his case and also the doctors who were on his case. The second one is The Heaven is for Real boy. This one is super well known. A young boy named Colton had a near-death experience during surgery. He claimed to have visited heaven.
Is that the one that turned out to be fake? I can never remember. It might have been. It might not have been. I can't remember.
Met Jesus and described events, here it is again, that he couldn't have known. Sounds impressive until you dig deeper. First, many of the details he shared were likely things that he overheard either before or after the surgery. Some of them were also things his parents had talked about, including the religious imagery that matched their evangelical beliefs. And over time, the story started to shift a little with each telling, which is exactly what we see in normal memory distortion. It's not lying. Your brain will do that on its own. It really is not lying. I'm not calling these people liars. I'm talking about normal memory distortion as you tell the story. And here's the kicker. Colton himself, later when he grew up, admitted he made up some of the story because of pressure and attention, and especially this pressure coming from his evangelical parents. So again, the experience may have felt.
And in fact, another interesting thing talking about memory distortion is that one of Jan Holden's studies showed that those who have near-death experiences, genuine near-death experiences, the memory when retelling them 20 years later are practically identical. There is no memory distortion, at least to the level that is very, very, very different to standard memories. In fact, I'm pretty sure she said that it was zero. Every detail is told in exactly the same way 20 years later, which is very impressive, considering, as Brittany rightly says, the memory distortion effect on general memory.
Felt real, but it became a kind of feedback loop. The more people believed it, the more the story grew. That's not evidence. That's narratives. That's what humans do. That's King Arthur stories and Christianity and Mormonism and any religion that you've ever heard of. There is narrative inflation that you can actually track in real time. It doesn't mean that these people are liars. That's just what our brains do. The third one that I want to highlight is Pam Reynolds. This is the gold standard story. This one is called the most convincing NDE ever recorded. Pam Reynolds had a rare brain surgery in the 90s that required her to be in hypothermic cardiac arrest. Essentially, she was brought close to death. And during that
Can I get another point here? Is she going to mention Gerald Burley?
time, she
Brittany.
reported seeing surgical instruments, hearing conversations, and floating above her body. And people claim this is proof because she was clinically dead and her brain was inactive. But here's what the data actually shows. Pam was under anesthesia, not entirely brain dead. There were intervals during the surgery where her brain was still active. And when your brain is active, it is taking in even something like sounds when your eyes are closed. The tools, the music in the room, even the conversation could have.
However, the perceptions that she encountered were not during those periods, according to. Don't think he wanted his name publicly out there, so I'll just say a very in-depth researcher for the Pam Reynolds case, who has done extensive work on it and rebuted, I suppose, that the experiences that she had and the perceptions that she had took place not during these periods where the brain was active, certainly took place during the periods where the brain was not so. Again, I'm taking his word for it as someone who has done a lot of research into this particular case. So take that what you will, but I don't have the email anymore. I should have kept it. Anyway, I brought up these questions. I saw these claims in an article online, and I brought them up with this guy, and I sent them to him, and he effectively said, yeah, that these, he laid out the full process of the procedure and said this is when these took place. These things happened that she saw and experienced, and it was during the time that the brain was not in an aware state, from what I can remember. After making this video, I did once again reach out to this researcher and just asked him to again clarify his points about the Pam Reynolds case and her perceptions and whether they did take place while her brain was indeed flatlined. This was his response. Hi Darren. When she made the observations, the first set, she was effectively flatlined. She was under barbiturate burst suppression at a 10-to-1 ratio, and that is a fact. Dr. Spetzler, who was Pam's head neurosurgeon in the case, confirmed it to me personally via email. Carl Green backed it up, but it's also in his published paper. It was simply the protocol of the procedure then. It's changed slightly now, but then that's how Spetzler did it. Skeptics keep getting this wrong because they can't believe it or they won't accept it, because it's supposedly not possible. But it happened, and it's happened more than once, I can assure you. I spoke to another neurosurgeon about this years ago, and he confirmed it. They have all the readings from this case that show she had no brainwaves at the points that she made her observations. She was monitored all the way through the operation. The researcher then forwarded me an email that he had sent to Dr. Jan Holden regarding the case. That read as follows. The first set of observations, the conversation and the sound / the usage of the Midas Rex bone saw, occurred when she was under burst suppression and at a temperature of around 32 degrees, when she was being hooked up to the bypass machine to cool her body down to the target temperature of 18 degrees. Just to clarify, these initial observations occurred before her heart was stopped and blood drained off. That occurred later in the operation, when the operating table was tipped up so that the surgeons could operate in a bloodless field, enabling them to do their very intricate work on the tiny blood vessels more precisely. Contrary to what some skeptics would have you believe, these initial observations were no less remarkable because at that time, when she was being hooked up to the bypass machine, she was under burst suppression, which equals no brainwaves. The drugs they administered then completely suppressed the electrical activity without stopping the heart and blood flow. This is a fact confirmed by Dr. Spetzler himself to me and two other author/researchers. Dr. Carl Green, Spetzler's then assistant, also confirmed this, along with additional corroboration. Now, just to add, at 32 degrees C, even if she hadn't been under any powerful drugs, she still would have lost between 25 to 50% of her brain function regardless, because of the hypothermia. For every 1 degree downwards, 5 to 10% of brain function is lost. So here we have a patient who has no brainwaves, at a temperature of 32 degrees with her ears taped and sealed and covered with molds of gauze, and 100 decibel clicking nodules plugged snugly into her ears, producing a sound at the same level as a jackhammer a few feet away. Her brainwaves, or the absence of, are also being monitored, and no brain activity was detected. Therefore, it is not even remotely possible that she could have been aware of anything. Spetzler has said it's literally impossible. Her second set of observations occurred when she was being rewarmed on the bypass machine after the clipping of the aneurysm. It was previously thought that her heart stopped during the rewarming at 32 degrees, twice. Dr. Michael Sabum recorded it at 32 degrees. In fact, her heart stopped twice, not at 32 degrees, but at 27 degrees. A fact I personally discovered. Consciousness is impossible at that temperature, regardless of anything else. So when the second observations were made, she was still full of barbiturates, i.e. no brain function, in cardiac arrest, which is clinical death, or always no brain function, severely hypothermic at 27 degrees, a temperature that basically makes you dead, and still with the loud clicking nodules in her ears. Note that even hypothetically, with no complete anaesthesia, wide awake and no cooling at all, surely the only sound she would have heard would have been the 100 decibel clicks at 11 per second, which were fed directly into her ear canal. She never reported these extremely loud clicks. On burst suppression, therapy, barbiturate, which was used in the Reynolds case, propofol or halogenated anaesthetic, is titrated to an electroencephalographic endpoint. Complete pharmacologic suppression results in a flatline EEG. Typically, a 1 to 10 burst to suppression ratio is chosen as an arbitrary endpoint, but this is neither evidence-based or a universal practice. In other words, a 10-second screen of EEG would have 1 second of burst activity and 9 seconds of flat EEG. The protocol from Spetzler's published paper. Our experience with profound hypothermia and circulatory arrest indicates that pre-arrest, pre-cooling administration of barbiturates, in quantity sufficient to maintain burst suppression of EEG activity, has not been deleterious and probably has improved cerebral protection. Taken from the article Aneurysms of the Basilar Artery Treated with Circulatory Arrest, Hypothermia and Barbiturate Cerebral Protection by Robert F. Spetzler et al. And finally, he included a brief temperature chart to correlate the temperature of the body with the experience of consciousness. 37 degrees, normal oral temperature. 36 degrees, metabolic rate increased. 35 degrees, maximum shivering seen and impaired judgment. 33 degrees, severe clouding of consciousness. 32 degrees, most shivering ceases and pupils dilate. 31 degrees, blood pressure may no longer be obtainable. 28 to 30 degrees, severe slowing of pulse and respiration, increased muscle rigidity, loss of consciousness, and ventricular fibrillation. And 27 degrees, loss of deep tendon, skin, and capillary reflexes. Patients appear clinically dead, complete cardiac arrest. And that concludes the emails I received from this researcher.
Have easily been overheard before she was fully unconscious or as she was coming out of it. Our brain can log a lot of information we don't realize that we're hearing because her conscious ego mind is not online yet. And anesthesia awareness is a real and documented phenomenon. So while the experience was meaningful and strange, it doesn't prove that her soul left her body. It proves that memory is messy and that consciousness and perception are not just on-off switches, and we are more aware than we maybe thought we were when you're just kind of laying on a table like this, right? So what does this all mean? It means that these experiences are real. Like, I'm not debating that the interpretations, but the interpretations that people build around them are often not. People feel things, they remember things, they draw conclusions, they project things. And these conclusions are shaped by belief and culture and trauma and family pressure and book deals and even media coverage. And once you start looking into these stories critically, you notice a pattern. The more magical the story sounds, the more likely it is that details have been added, stretched, or misremembered over time. And the more likely you're also able to find a doctor who says, that's not really what happened. So
this is also why, and she's absolutely right, but this is also why you should look at books like Instead the Self Does Not Die, those that include veridical aspects that have been corroborated and confirmed by professionals, and those who are actually at the situation at the time, and the cases of which have been thoroughly researched and dug into to prevent any of these effects taking place. So although the popular NDE books like Proof of Heaven, like Heaven is for Real, like so many others that are popular because they're very emotional and very subjective and very, they play to the soul, I suppose, they don't offer evidence for survival. That's where books like The Self Does Not Die and the journals showing the experimentation done for various other phenomena as well all come together to create an evidential framework for these phenomena.
But we want these stories to be true. We only read like the magical ones, and it just feels so convincing that we just want it to be true so bad because we don't want to be afraid to die. So we make them all true without looking at the science too closely, which is what we know our brains do all the time. Religion is full of this. So after all this, after we've looked at the brain science, the cultural shaping, the debunked stories, you might wonder, is there actually any good argument for taking NDEs seriously as something more than brain activity?
Yes, veridical perception.
And I would say still yes. There's still an argument that gives me pause. It's the argument from veridical perception, which is people reporting seeing or hearing things during an NDE that they shouldn't have been able to perceive.
Which to me is really the only evidential value of near-death experiences in terms of empirical evidence.
Because they were unconscious or clinically dead at the time. So, for example, someone flatlines in the hospital, their EEG shows no measurable brain activity, but when they're revived, it'll accurately describe something that just seems like, how could you possibly know that, even if you are accounting for subconscious information? And that story is rare, but it's not unheard of. And it makes some researchers, even skeptical ones, say like, I can't fully explain this. One of the most excited examples is from the AWARE study, Awareness During Resuscitation, led by Sam Parnia. This was a large multi-hospital study where researchers tried to catch these rare moments by placing hidden images in operating rooms, up on shelves, that kind of thing, that if someone had an out-of-body experience, that they could be able to report the image. And not a single person, of course, has identified the images, but in a few.
Again, that's a game of numbers. From 2,020 patients, there was 2 that had out-of-body experiences and were survived long enough, at least, to be interviewed afterwards. I think they went through 2 rounds of interviews, and neither of them had their experiences in places where the target actually was.
Few cases, people did report specific things about what happened while they were technically dead that were later confirmed by hospital staff. Now, are these cases airtight? No. Critics point out that the EEGs don't pick up everything and that we don't fully understand the timing of memory formation under stress. This is still a lot of mystery as far as where.
There is the argument that EEG only really records cortical activity and not the deeper brain tissue activity. And I wonder whether it's viable or whether it's reasonable to argue that even though there's no cortical activity, no measurable cortical activity, that consciousness is still possible, or at least, heightened consciousness where memory retention is possible from an experiential point of view. Because surely if cortical activity is needed, and we know it is needed really for these high levels of consciousness, never mind heightened levels of consciousness as is experienced in near-death experiences that seem more real than real, does unmeasurable EEG activity, can that account for that kind of experience? When surely, the lower levels of the brain, the deeper levels of the brain are more the survival mechanisms as opposed to cognition. Cognition? I think cognition. I don't know, but that's just something I've wondered about.
Where the science is today, and that some of these memories might have been reconstructed afterward, but we don't have solid proof of that. So the best idea for NDEs is something like this. Sometimes people seem to know things that they seemingly shouldn't.
Correct.
Sometimes their experiences contain specific, verifiable information during a time when we don't understand how aware they could have been.
Or in a state where we know with all reasonable science done up to this point on the subject that they shouldn't have been. She's absolutely right and very intellectually honest when she says that that's as far as we can take it, because near-death experiences do not, and this is important, do not prove life after death. All we can say about near-death experiences is exactly as she just said, that there are cases which provide evidence to show that the brain, or that consciousness experience exists in times where the brain should not reasonably be able to produce it, and that experiences exist in which people see or perceive things that they should not be able to perceive due to their state of brain state, or even their physical location relative to what they experienced or what they perceived. You can also argue that things like evidential mediumship and other phenomena can provide evidence that information can be received from non-physical means somehow, accurately on occasion, but we can't say that therefore that proves that we continue after death, although it may be, I think, highly suggestive of that fact. Not that fact, but that potential.
And I will admit, I will hear stories where, you know what, I cannot fully explain how memory could have been formed for what they could have known or what could not have happened, could have happened or not happened. But 99% of NDE phenomena, I really think can be better explained by brain chemistry, trauma response, culture, brain projection. We really can explain the vast majority of these stories with just good science and naturalistic neuroscientific explanations. But even that 1%, like let's say that some of these stories are actually true, the ones that we can't quite explain or we have to consider as something happening that speaks to something greater, we have to ask the question, is that happening more than normal? Because for every magical NDE story, there are hundreds or thousands where people don't have a typical NDE story.
But again, this is a white crow thing, because it doesn't matter how many times it doesn't happen, and more people don't have an NDE than do, and more people who have an NDE, far more people that have an NDE don't have veridical perception. But the fact that it happens, and it happens against all reason for the way we understand the physical world and the physical brain to behave, shows that something's happening, I think. And I think there's more than enough cases. I think 99% is quite high. It's quite a bold thing, quite a bold figure to throw out there. But again, have a look at things like yes, read the books that are popular, but don't take them as evidential value. You should look at things like The Self Does Not Die, that has over 100 veridical cases, many of which you'd never have heard of before, that have been deeply researched and corroborated. That should be your source of reference for the science of near-death experiences. And there are a lot more of them than you'd think. So I think 99% is bold, reasonable, I think, for most people. But I would say, I don't know, I wouldn't dare throw out a figure, but I'd say it's not quite 99%.
Where things just went black, or they say they felt like something was happening and it wasn't happening. But because it doesn't fit the pattern of what we want, we forget all those. So even if there are a few hits that are magical, when you look closer, it's not like it's happening at higher rates than random. Whenever you apply solid science to this, it just starts to break down for me. True.
But again, whether they happen at random or not, they still shouldn't be happening according to our current physical understanding of the world, and that's the important thing. With something like mediumship, that's different, because if you give out a general statement, someone will pick it up. If you say a non-general statement, as long as you're saying it to a lot of people, someone by random chance is going to pick that up, just through coincidence that it happens to apply to them, and statistically it was inevitable. But when it comes to something that defies everything we understand, or everything we think we know about how the brain produces consciousness, when it's physically impossible that something happened that did happen, then regardless of how rare it is, the fact that it happens at all is the white crow.
Now, does that mean that I know for sure that there's no life after death? No, there's
No one
no
knows.
like smoking gun here where I can know for sure that NDEs aren't pointing to something real. It's kind of like the argument for atheism. Atheism isn't, I know for sure that there is no God. It's saying there is not enough evidence for me to be convinced of a God.
That's a difficult one. Is atheism, because what's the difference between atheism and agnosticism? Because I would say I'm agnostic in the sense that I don't believe there's a God. I don't believe there's no God. I don't know. There could be. I haven't seen any reasonable evidence. I wouldn't consider myself an atheist, though, because again, that depends on what God is. What do you define as God? If you're talking about the religious gods, the Christian God, the Islamic God, etc., the one that judges you and that you need to believe in or else you go to hell, again, I've always said I'm an atheist to that God because I don't believe it exists, but again, can I reasonably say that? Because it could. It's not impossible. I certainly hope it's not. But I can't be certain of that, because how can you be certain of anything? I've seen no reasonable evidence, no strong evidence to suggest that that's true. And I think all the evidence suggests that that type of God doesn't exist. But I would still consider myself agnostic because I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows, truly knows. You can believe strongly one way or the other, but knowledge is very different, because some things I think just can't really be known, no matter how unlikely it is. So I suppose for practical purposes, I would say I'm an atheist to a religious God, but certainly agnostic to a general idea of God, leaning maybe more toward I believe there is something, but I don't think it's an individual. I think it's a nature of reality that is yet to be undiscovered, but is a scientific question, not a religious one to discover.
And
probably an irrelevant rant, but never mind.
I really do think that's the most rational response when you look at all of this data. You cannot know for sure that all NDEs are explicable at the level of the brain, and there's nothing kind of magical going on here. But you can, I think, say, I don't have enough evidence to make that kind of leap into the supernatural.
And not just you can say that, you should say that. If that's true for you, you don't have enough evidence, then fine. But never shut that door, because perhaps you just haven't done, a deep dive into all of the literature to get the context as to why some people believe it. A lot of people will criticize, usually the staunch kind of disbelievers who maybe professionally disbelieve things, or are just so closed off that they are very critical towards beliefs like an afterlife, but they've never taken the time to understand the context as to why we believe that such a thing might exist. And it's reasonable to believe that such a thing might exist when you have read the research and spoken to the people that have spent their lives researching it. I've heard the argument that it's the consensus of neuroscientists and of consciousness researchers that and of consciousness philosophers that the brain produces the mind. Fine. But it's the consensus of those who have studied these phenomena in detail, for all of their lives, that such a thing does exist. So although the consensus of science overall, and of neuroscience overall, and of philosophy, whatever, overall, might say that it's more likely there's no consciousness after death, the consensus of those who have actually focused in on this area and have done the deep diving into the literature is that vast majority, vast consensus, is that yes, the evidence seems to suggest that it's more likely than not, much more likely than not, that an afterlife exists. So the important thing being, if you're looking to learn about a subject and are looking to criticize a subject, make sure you know the full context of why we believe that. Because sometimes you'll come across evidence that you never knew existed. But again, make sure you get it from the right place, talk to the right people, read the right things, and understand it fully from a scientific point of view.
And so many naturalistic explanations are still on the table. That, I think, is the most rational stance. And so I think we can explain with natural explanations. And then the part that's still perhaps mysterious, where like the edges of the map of our current understanding, we can still be open to whatever ends up being true. But that,
I don't think any of the natural explanations that have been put forward have been fully explanatory for the near-death experience, even the subjective phenomena. Some, many have explained certain parts, certainly, but when put all together, they don't work for other aspects, if you know what I mean. So there's been no one naturalistic explanation, which I don't like the term, because any explanation will be natural. It's just probably a nature of things that we haven't understood yet. But our current understanding of nature, in terms of naturalism, using that, to define naturalism, no one particular explanation has been sufficient.
that does not mean that a lack of scientific
And that's not including with veridical aspects as well.
knowledge somewhere is the same as evidence to make a big supernatural leap. There is no evidence for NDEs pointing to an afterlife or life after, or something, information about consciousness that should make you have a confident leap into the supernatural. Is it?
There's no evidence for NDEs that should enable you to confidently leap into the supernatural. Depends on the strength of the evidence. One can believe, as many do, that near-death experiences are evidence of an afterlife, and therefore believe that there is an afterlife. Many do not for evidence, but for religion, etc., which to me is not a reasonable belief. But I think from an evidential point of view, if you're really familiar with the evidence of an afterlife from near-death experiences and other phenomena, I think it's more than reasonable to confidently believe that there's life after physical death. Or not even life after death, but that life continues and doesn't end as such. So there's no after, there's just a continuation. I think that's perfectly reasonable to confidently jump into, again, supernatural, I suppose, yet undiscovered, natural, as I prefer to call it. But certainly she's right that you must always look for explanations within the framework of what we currently understand before jumping toward the supernatural. But I think that hurdle has been crossed to where it is now reasonable to say that I believe in a life after death. But one must always be open to change that idea when new evidence comes up, even though that might terrify you.
Possible? Is it an explanation on the table? Sure. But always remember that it is far more likely statistically when we look back in history that science is going to fill that gap rather than the supernatural.
I agree. However, lightning, as I said earlier, lightning was supernatural until we developed the science to explain it. That didn't invoke supernatural, something beyond nature. It just expanded our understanding of science to the natural world. This is going to be the same thing with an afterlife, with the nature of consciousness. It's not going to be supernatural, which is why I don't like the term. It's going to be an expansion of science to include those phenomena, to extend our framework of understanding what the universe is, what reality is, what consciousness is. It's not going to be consciousness is magic and there's life after death because a magical god can defy the laws of nature. It will be in the laws of nature. It's just a phenomenon, a fundamental part of nature that we don't understand yet. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say that science, as we currently know it, is incomplete, and that these phenomena will lead us toward expanding our science to discover what consciousness is, but it doesn't necessarily have to fit in to science as we currently know it, because it's not a given that science as we currently know it is a complete model of reality, as certainly of consciousness. So if there is life after death, what I'm saying is if there is life after death, it's going to be because that's naturally what happens. The same way that gravity is natural, and that if you throw something in the air, it comes back down. It's just that we don't understand it yet.
Because every single other time in history where we were at the edge of science and jumped into a supernatural explanation when there were still natural explanations on the table, we were wrong.
And again, but at that time we didn't know that science was to expand into to explaining those things. So certainly for us now, how as life after death is supernatural to us, so back then lightning was supernatural to the people that existed then, until science developed to be able to explain it. So again, now that we're here, although life after death and consciousness might seem, or ghosts or whatever else might seem supernatural, it's more than possible that science just hasn't expanded yet to allow for that phenomena and to understand it. So not supernatural, just a limitation of science, which can always expand to describe these things, and it will be natural.
100% of the time. That process only goes in one direction. So can we know for sure that there's this proves there's no soul or no afterlife? No, we can't say that. I'm not saying that. But do you have enough evidence to jump into the supernatural, even for those few cases where we feel like there's a little bit of mystery?
Yes.
No, I don't think we have any kind of evidence like that. What we have is 99.
That's interesting. Don't think we have any kind of evidence for that. Again, it depends. I don't know. God bless her. I'm sure she absolutely is honest with what she says. I don't know how far into the research she's delved, and that's not a criticism. That's just there's a lot of it out there. So I don't know how far people have gone into this thing, but I think there's more than enough evidence to suggest that it happens. I think a reasonable inference to the data we have is that consciousness may continue to exist after death. The mechanisms, what that's like, we don't know yet, but it seems to happen. And it seems that we can experience things that we shouldn't be able to experience in the physical world. I was going to say real world then, but in the physical world, while in states that shouldn't be supported with our brain function being so limited as it is in those cases.
9% naturalistic explanations, and 1% a little bit of mystery because we're at the edge of the map of scientific understanding of memory in the brain. That's what we have here. I think.
But that doesn't mean that the next step in science is going to be more physical understanding of the brain. It could be that we determine from these experiences that the brain is an intermediary. It could be the image of something more, as Bernardo Kastrup posits, and others, of course, idealists. It doesn't necessarily mean that the next thing that we discover about the brain and consciousness is how it creates it. It could be that how it interprets it, how it filters it, how it receives it, how it presents it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a causational step in science. It could be, well, we don't know. It could be literally anything because the universe is so strange and reality is, we haven't got a clue.
That's not a strong enough jump to jump into like, oh, a kid saw Jesus, therefore I know that Christianity is true and that's reality.
That's wrong.
Like there's no evidence to make that kind of leap. The only reason we are making that kind of leap is because of the real thing that's going on underneath all of this, which is how hard we try and our brains try without even us being aware of it, how hard we try to cheat death.
Is that begging the question that, again, that the brain is the foundation for everything, and that there is no fundamental thing outside of the brain produces consciousness? That seems to be, maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but again, we don't know. I think there is evidence to suggest that there is something going on separate from the brain.
Hard we try to use even science and rationality because of our emotional fears of death that may be so underneath the surface we don't even know that that's what's pulling on the strings here. It is not a coincidence that religious people who deconstruct their religion, the first thing they get into is NDEs. Their brain is looking for a story to deal with death and a way to cheat death literally the day after they leave religion. Whereas people who have a lot of tools for their fear of death and they've processed it don't seem to go down this rabbit hole with the same level of intensity or faith because they don't need anything here to be true. And so I want to touch on something that doesn't get talked about enough, why so many people are deconstructing their religion and how they're ending up in near-death experience content.
Because religion just doesn't make sense. I mean, to me, certainly it doesn't. There's so many contradictions in organised religion. I can only really speak for Christianity because that was the culture I was brought up in, but Noah's Ark doesn't work for me. Creation in 6 days, 7 days doesn't work for me because, fossils exist and radioactive or radiation aging and things like that exist. The idea that God loves us eternally and yet will allow children in Africa to have to walk 7 miles a day for contaminated water that gives them cholera and kills them through dehydration and parasites, and then will put you into hell for eternity for just not believing in him when you had no reason to believe in him in the first place, doesn't sit well with me. And there's just no evidence for it. Well, there is evidence for it, but not good evidence. For example, there's the Bible. That is evidence. It's not good evidence, in my opinion, because the Bible was written 2,000 or so years ago in a completely different culture, in a completely different time, and has changed God knows how many times since then to be the version that we know now, which is going to be completely different to what it was originally intended to be. So, although you could argue, yes, it's evidence of a God, it's not good evidence, not to me.
And I say this with no judgment, like I've been there, but here's what I think is going on. When someone deconstructs their religion, or they feel like they're just struggling in general, even if they weren't raised in religion, your story is collapsing, and what's left behind is this kind of terrifying silence. It's not intellectual science, but more like emotional disorientation. If you were in religion, you'll go from like, I don't know what happens when I die, to I have no idea what happens. If you're from religion, you go, I know what happens when I die, to I have no idea what happens, and I might just disappear forever. And the brain does not like that kind of gap. The moment that certainty gets pulled out, especially around death, the brain goes hunting for a replacement, for a new story, a softer one, a more modern one, something that gives you some kind of narrative continuity, even if you don't want to go back to religion. And so that's where kind of NDE content shows up the most, as this kind of spiritual methadone. It feels like a middle ground. It's not organized religion. It's not dogma. It's not like, this old school, like there's an afterlife, but you're going to burn in hell forever. But it still gives you this glimpse of hope. Hey, there's a neuroscientist over here that believes in near-death experiences.
Problem is, most people who approach near-death experiences do so for comfort and not for the scientific kind of investigation. So they'll go to these emotional stories that are purely subjective with no veridical aspects to them, and try and suggest that that's evidence of an afterlife, which you could argue it is, because it's common between many different people, and the fundamental things are all the same, which is true. That is evidence. But to me, that alone is not strong enough evidence to sway me to believe that there's an afterlife. You need to go into the veridical aspect and into the studies, and spread out from near-death experiences into remote viewing, terminal lucidity, evidential mediumship, and just all these various different other evidential areas that have been researched and in blinded studies and peer-reviewed and replicated. And then you can develop kind of a scientific background and a contextual background as to why I think, anyway, that it is reasonable to believe in an afterlife from an evidential point of view.
It gives you a glimpse of light, of meaning. It helps you feel like something continues after death, even if you don't have to believe in like a Santa Claus kind of God anymore. And again, like, this is understandable, this is human, but contrast that with someone who's gone through a secular process of death acceptance, someone who's sat with their mortality, someone who has grieved the loss of the afterlife story, someone who has done the psychological and philosophical work to make peace with not knowing. When those people encounter NDE stories, they might still be interested, they might even be moved, but they don't dive into it with the same kind of urgency or emotional dependency, because they don't need to believe. They can just kind of like hold it loosely.
And I got into the research initially from fear of death, and the idea of death being the annihilation of consciousness completely terrified me, mainly because of my anxiety disorder, which focuses around that. But I got into it, and I became as aware as possible of any kind of confirmation biases and other biases that took effect. And I think I've come to a reasonable belief in life after death, based purely on the research I've done and the talks I've had with those who have been actively researching these areas for many, many decades and most of their lives. And so, yes, I want there to be life after death. However, I think I've managed to kind of reach a point where I can stop myself from forcing things into place where they have no business being in terms of evidence. And I still think it's reasonable. There's more than enough evidence now to suggest that it's a reasonable proposition that there is life after physical death, or as I say, a continuation of life after the death of the brain.
Read some stories, read a few books. Oh yeah, there's a few options on the table. And they've developed tools that kind of just allow them to live in that ambiguity. But they don't tend to like have faith that this has to be real because this is where I have my last morsel of hope. Because you don't need to do that if you've actually faced death. So I think what's happening here is not really about whether or not NDEs are pointing to something more real or magical or whatever. I think what's really happening is what is the emotional scaffolding you've built around the fear of death. And if you just left religion or you're in a place in your life where you're raw and vulnerable, NDEs can feel like a lifeline.
Because it's not just leaving a religion, it's leaving an entire way of viewing the world and reality and everything. It's, as someone who has an anxiety disorder, I know what it's like to have kind of existential threats from things that aren't kind of physically real. Like, I mean, with my anxiety, it's based around the fear of being ill. And so my body responds in a way as if there's a threat when there isn't. And for human beings, the threat of a worldview is just as terrifying to our brains as a physical threat to our life. So it's no different to kind of losing a worldview or having a worldview shattered in front of you than there is of having your entire life shattered in front of you. It's losing something that's integral to your understanding of yourself and the world. So of course, that's not an easy process. And of course, your brain will look for things to grasp onto to keep that familiarity close to your chest. And it's a very difficult thing.
Because if you've already processed death or built a secular spirituality kind of story that can hold loss and impermanence, you don't really need the NDE story to be magic as much. You can just appreciate that this seems to be a thing that happens to people when they're dying without clinging to any truth claims around it. So the popularity of NDE content among people deconstructing faith isn't a coincidence. It's a narrative trauma response. That's what's going on at the deeper level.
But again, I think when you look into the science of the near-death experience, the actual research done on veridical perception and other things, regardless of whether you are at peace with the possibility that death is the end, I still think that there is very reasonable evidence to suggest that it's not. Now, from an objective point of view, in the research done.
Level. So if I have a client who says they're super into NDEs, I will write down in my notes, we need to do some death work, because here's what happens every time. If you do the death work first and then go back to the NDE stories, then it's just stories. I wonder what's going on here. What an interesting story. You don't need anything to be true. You can hold on to many perspectives, many opinions and stories on the table. You can discuss it and watch YouTube videos, but it's like playful curiosity. And you don't get that from people who are using NDEs as their scaffold against death or their last place where there's some hope that there's something more going on here. From them, they will attack me or bear testimony or do a lot of what about isms, just like people in religion. And they are actually, whether they know it or not, having a religious faith and relationship with NDEs as the story that their brain is using to have hope and cheat death.
Depends what you mean by religious faith. If you mean by religious faith as in, believing something that isn't evidentially true, I would argue that that's not the case in NDEs. Although maybe for most people it would be, because they wouldn't be familiar with the literature. However, for me and for those of us who have really dived into the research and spoken with the researchers, I don't think it's a religious faith. I think it's an evidential based, reasonable hypothesis, to be honest.
Death. So my advice is always the same. I don't know exactly what happens after we die. I don't think there's a smoking gun for either side. But my advice is face death first. Be totally okay with the fact that you're going to die. And
that's difficult. That's very difficult, because our millions and millions and millions of years of evolution has done the complete opposite. It has been for the purpose of doing the opposite, evading death, keeping death away. And humans naturally are terrified of death. We're supposed to be. That keeps us alive. it's probably worse for me with the anxiety disorder, which does focus around being ill and dying. So for me, I think, for me personally, I think accepting death as an annihilation of consciousness, which again, to me, isn't the likely outcome. It wouldn't be viable nor productive for me. But for most people, sure, absolutely. But again, we don't want to push the belief that death is the annihilation of consciousness if that's not what it is. And I think the evidence suggests that that's not what it is. Although I can understand it from a therapeutic point of view, if you can kind of come to terms with that as an outcome, then you would be much more at peace with the rest of your life, I suppose, without having that existential fear. And then maybe later grow a more organic interest in the subject and discover that maybe there is more going on.